Namaste, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa, and ahead of our Independence Day, we're going to have a look at the way ahead for us as a nation, our hopes and fears, challenges and opportunities. So, to discuss this, I have with me uh, Ashutosh Muglikar, popularly known as Gariboka economist, and who has a knack for articulating seemingly complex concepts in a simple, lucid way. Welcome, Ashu. Glad to have you on the podcast.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Carrie, for inviting me yet again.
Thanks for being here and making his debut today on the Bharat Varta podcast. We have Karan Basin, who is a researcher and also is known for his interesting views on the Indian economy. Welcome, Karan.
Thanks for having me here, Roshan.
And finally, to complete this stellar lineup, we have Ashish Chandorkar, our resident expert on all things politics and policy. Ashish is also a prolific columnist and an author. Welcome, Ashish.
Thank you, Carrie.
Ashish, this time I didn't call you a communist by mistake.
Yeah, I think it's a good, especially on this episode, it would have been a little too much to as a communist.
We're off to a good start, right? All right, guys. So I think the sheer breadth of things that we can discuss is it's pretty wide, right? So to begin with, I'll get your short answer on what it is that you're most optimistic for with India at 73. The economy, the culture, or the politics. I know that all three are, very intrinsically linked to each other. But just quick round the table. So maybe we'll start with you, Karan.
Well, I would say I'm more optimistic regarding the politics at the moment than the economy. I'm not saying that I'm not optimistic about the economy. I am, but you have to view both the things simultaneously. And what's happening in the political space is the complete dismantling of Nehruvian socialism. And I think that is exactly what really makes me optimistic that 10 years down the line, the India that we see is going to be very different from the one that we have at present.
Fantastic. Not holding any punches back. Off to a blazing start. Ashu, next up. So what are you most optimistic for? Politics, economy, or culture?
Carrie, it's a very difficult question, but I will go with the economy. Although the current growth rates, the quarterly rates, etc., are not very positive, but still, I think I will go with economy. Simply for 5 reasons. One, I am very optimistic because our economy has transformed in the last 6 years and it is firmly standing on 5 very strong pillars. And those are, according to me, the demographic dividend that we have, the urban development that is happening, the infrastructure development that is going on, and the JAM Trinity that we are witnessing as of now. While all these things are going on, the development is taking care of the environment as well, and we are seeing a sustainable model of, say, for example, power generation. And I think all these things are going to play a major role in the coming 10 years. And I am very, very optimistic with regards to economy when you give these 3 options.
Okay, fantastic. Ashish, you want to round things off by saying culture?
Actually, I would actually go with politics as well. See, my sense is that the politics and the policy making has become more purposeful in the recent years in India. And I expect that to continue over the next decade. I think the next decade is very important for us in several ways, be it in terms of demographics, where we will have probably the most, it's probably the most important decade actually, the next, let's say 17, 18 years in terms of the working age population. Also how what kind of jobs do we create, quality of it, and so on, right? So I think all of that needs a little bit of political nudge in India, the way things work, because the policies are actually not as much doctrinal in nature, but however, it depends on how much conviction the governments have in states and in center to basically do the right thing. And it may not be very dogmatic in terms of any ideology per se, but just basically keep tweaking things as we go along. I think that process has become much more purposeful, and I expect that to accelerate in the coming years. So I think it's the political structure in the country, which then would hopefully nudge the economic direction in the right in the right way and at the right quantum.
Yeah, I'd also agree with what you said. I think politics is a vehicle for action, right? So at the end of the day, I mean, we could have all of this, intricately drawn up plans, but then, I mean, to see any kind of tangible reality, I think politics is the medium, right? And I'm optimistic on that front as well. Okay, so we'll split the podcast into 3 segments where we discuss economy, culture, and then politics. In each of these segments, we'll discuss challenges and opportunity on all fronts, and maybe we can go back and forth, right? So we'll begin with economy. Karan, you heard Ashu speak about various things, right? But there's been a lot of doom and gloom on the economy side, and 2020 in particular has been a tough year. What do you see as some of the continuing challenges?
Okay, so there's no doubt that 2020 is definitely a challenging year, and it comes with the backdrop of a growth recession. And in fact, that growth recession was very severe in its own way. So while we were recovering from that growth recession, it's very important to understand why that recession actually happened in the first place. To give you a statistic, between 2014 and 2016, our money supply growth was still growing at a very decent rate. Post 2016, the rate of supply of money growth stopped. What essentially I'm trying to communicate is that liquidity crunch became very severe post 2016, 17, and then 18 because RBI had a very tight monetary policy. And what happened as a consequence was that your financial sector went into trouble, starting with IL&FS and non-banking financial companies, which affected the consumption in the year 2019-20. Just as we were starting to recover, now we were hit by pandemic, which means that there are inherent weaknesses that need to be resolved, especially in the financial sector. I think a bulk of them have to be addressed by the RBI, while some of them will also require the government to step up and take action. So the key going forward is just how good the coordination between the monetary and fiscal policy is. How do they address some of these challenges in the financial sector? Because until and unless we address these vulnerabilities, it will be difficult to get back to 7.5% growth in say next financial year or maybe the next to next financial year. And I think broadly Ashutosh sir will also agree that the financial sector stress has definitely been a drag over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so Ashu, question to you, how do we solve this? I mean, you mentioned some of those fundamental things like the JAM Trinity or the infrastructure development and so on and so forth, right? But how do we solve the fundamental issue of the stress in the financial sector?
Look, Carrie, while we are talking about the financial sector issues, we have to understand the legacy issues that were carried on by our banking system. In between the period that Karan just mentioned, we had a very good legislation called the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. That was very necessary to bring because of the non-performing assets issues that were lying with our banking and NBFC companies. During that time, once that legislation was put in place, the intent of the government was absolutely clear. In fact, the letter or the law that they had passed was also pretty strong, and it had a fixed timelines to issue to resolve all the bad loan issues. But going ahead, because of the various litigations, many parties, going right up to Supreme Court to stop the resolution process, etc. It took a lot of time for that IBC to fructify. I can even tell you some examples where the resolution time has taken such a long time that the original intent of the act has not been achieved. Yeah. Now, what I'm trying to tell you is that once you have these legacy issues in the banking system itself, in the financial sector, plaguing the entire financial system, it leads to your capital getting stuck. Now, when your capital for the banks is stuck, it is not put to productive use elsewhere. Now that also leads to another issue where we have high interest rates. Yeah. Now, because of the high interest rates, again, it is going to affect our company, their profitability, our competitiveness. Again, they are not just competing with Indian companies, but global companies now. So I think these things take little time. as of now, the precedents are set. A lot of things have been clarified by the Supreme Court. Various notifications have come into the picture, and then when things were improving a bit, we were hit with this COVID-19. I think we should give it a little time. These things will materialize, and we will soon be seeing good positive outcome of all these legislations that the government has passed. And I think time is the solution. To answer your question, we need to be a little patient.
Right. Ashish, do you have any comments to add?
Yeah, Carrie, definitely. See, the challenge with the economy has been that we have been doing structural reforms in quick successions. And so first of all, having a compounded effect of those reforms itself is a challenge, in the sense that each of those reforms probably disrupts the existing way of doing business, which also means that things which were well oiled then have to be restarted, right? So like if you go back and let's start with, say, demonetization. Then we had GST about 9 months later, or actually 7 months later. Now GST was a long pending reform, and it was a long pending necessity, and it has been done. But of course, it, like in all things in India, nothing can be perfect at the scale at which we operate. And although it has got benefits in terms of new company enrollment and the states getting more visibility about their taxes, but the fact is that it did bring in some disruption in the ways of working, because the economy used to be informal, and now the informal chain started breaking. So then we had RERA, the Real Estate Regulatory Authority, which kind of pushed back the growth a little bit on the real estate side, which is a huge generator of employment as well as of the economic growth, because given the domino, in fact, it has on a host of industries. And then we had the IBC Act, which Ashu already spoke about, right? So the challenge with some of these things is that you keep doing these things in quick succession. And while you cannot isolate the impact of one or fully absorb the impact of one, you have another change coming in. So as a cumulative thing, while of course I think we all agree that in long term these are all very beneficial steps and there'll be a tailwind, but in the short run there's pain. Now the pain, whether it is 2 quarters or 2 years or 5 years, I think that is where people disagree. So I think that probably economists can make more sense of that timing perspective. But I think let's take a step back, carry on the whole economics debate as such, right? India will hit about if you look at the working age population in India, that which is 25 to 64 years.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a quick a point to add on that front, right? I mean, so a lot of people feel that the government is using its political capital to push these fundamental reforms, right? So do you think that's actually the right thing for them to do, or do you think that do you feel otherwise?
Well, I mean, these things are needed, right? Like unless you make the changes, and the changes have to be institutionalized in nature, right? So, for example, one point which has talked about is phone banking. Unless someone in Delhi took a call that yes, we will not influence how the loans are disbursed to the various industrial groups, we wouldn't have changed the ways of our, banking sector has a stress. It would still be under stress 10 years from now if that wasn't changed, right? So now it's a hard call, but the challenge is that the system was geared towards getting loans only because someone was calling from Delhi, and that's not happening anymore. So now how do you make that? I mean, how would a borrower now suddenly demonstrate that the borrowing capacity is there, the repayment capacity is there, and the business model is good, right? So I think those changes now, those kind of changes will take time, and which is why I said whether it will take 2 quarters or 2 years or even more, we don't know. But if you take a step back on this, Carrie, like let's look at a few fundamental shifts which are happening in India. One is that if you look at the demographics, India will have the working age population peaking around 2038, 2039, which is like 25 years to 64 years of age, people who are in that age bracket. That ratio of that population to the total population will peak at around 54% in India, and we still have about whole 2 decades of that population to be absorbed. Generally, what happens is when your working age population is growing, that leads into a consumption growth, because naturally when people work and they earn, they obviously spend, and I think that effect will definitely be there. One of our regular guests, Harsh Gupta, had done a very good analysis which said that in India, typically the GDP per capita has been growing at 1 percentage point. I mean, if you look at an average per decadal GDP per capita, it grows at 1% per decade. So, like we achieved about 6% of GDP per capita growth in this decade, and hence we should ideally go up to 7% given the past trends of the last 40 odd years. And partly the reason is demographics, because people are entering the workforce, they work, they earn, and they spend, and which is why it gives rise to a fairly big consumption drive within the economy. So I think that is a very important aspect, which is like one big part of how India would operate. Now, the other part is government spending, which of course, at least in this government, it has been pretty clear that there's a lot of focus on infrastructure spending and creating marquee projects and marquee assets, which have got a tailwind of their own in terms of the local economy impact and so on. The challenge in India, as Karan mentioned, was actually on the private investment side. Like, how much can we stabilize that or essentially ignite that? That I think will be the key question, and the financial system stability plus the lending capacity of our capacity and intent of our banks and the NBFCs will come into question. But I think that to me is the main puzzle to be solved. Otherwise, on the key economic side, which is essentially your demographics, we will have the best run between now and say 2040 or so.
On precisely that question regarding the growth process itself is such that once we do get the growth back on track, either through government spending or through maybe foreign investments coming in because of supply chain reorientation, etc., that process of growth will automatically have a spillover benefit to the balance sheets of financial intermediaries, which is why one of the questions that all of us have been engaged in is that what is the time frame at which we look at financial sector operating at pre-crisis level again, and to the best of our ability, I think there's a near consensus that it will take at least a year and a half, which means that next year we'll have rebound growth, and after that there will be a takeoff, which will ensure that we really achieve 7 to 8% and around broadly 12 to 14% nominal growth rate going forward, which is pretty good and consistent with what even Ashish sir was saying regarding demographics, etc. So, as I said, the next decade is going to be one of the probably only decade that India has experienced where we will be able to sustain a high growth rate for the entire decade. And that is what makes it really, one of the most critical areas. And a lot of people ask that why is it important to push for reforms if they have short-term pain? The reason why reforms are important is because a lot of people don't understand this, that growth happens through either enhancement in productivity or in inputs. So you employ more labor and capital, you grow faster, or you increase productivity. Now, a lot of the reforms that are happening are actually productivity enhancing reforms, whether it's suspension of labor norms, whether it's getting rid of our land norms, etc., allowing for land to be moved away from low productive agriculture to high productive or more productive manufacturing, getting surplus labor transferred. So all of that really has a lot of positive spillover benefits in terms of enhanced growth over the medium term. And the only reason why we continue to remain very optimistic in the medium to long run could not have happened had they not have the mandate that they had and the political will to push for some of these reforms.
Taking a cue from what Karan said and what Ashish mentioned, look, like for example, demography and the productivity, what Karan just mentioned. We just had the new education policy which was introduced by the government. Now, when you have a demography which is 28, 29 in the median age, now they will need a lot of reskilling going ahead. There is AI, ML, automation, all these things are coming in. All the skills that these people are carrying, the textbooks or whatever learnings they are having, they will also need a lot of reskilling. So now you will ask me, what will be the effect of new education policy? In the short term, I don't know. Nobody will know. But it will be necessary. A lot of the workforce that is out there will need a lot of reskilling going ahead. That will play a very important role in utilizing the demography, and what Karan mentioned, it will also increase the productivity. So all these things are interconnected. That is all I wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean it's I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit of a common sense thing, right? I mean, even if you look at, let's say, a restaurant hikes its prices in the short term, it'll incur a cost, right? Obviously, it has to change menu, reoriented staff, so on and so forth, right? So if you look at the scale of reforms that we're doing, the fact that we're incurring these short term costs is but obvious, right? Uh, so I actually want to touch upon the demographic dividend, right? So anytime this demographic dividend comes in the same breath, they also talk about jobs and the fact that we'll have to employ all these people and so on and so forth. Do anyone of you have comments on that specifically in terms of how we're going to skill these people and then prep them to take up these jobs and be productive?
I can take a short carry at that answer. So there are three parts to this. One is on the skilling side. So the fact is that your workforce will grow at a fairly fast clip, or rather the fastest clip that it has in the recent years for another 2 decades or so, right? So need to ensure that the right skills are imparted and your training processes make people employable. Now, we did an episode on national education policy last week, and this point was discussed in fair amount of detail, that how the NEP is specifically looking at employability as a key indicator of success of the process of imparting education. So I think the thought process is there. We are talking more about vocational education, about people being comfortable in their surroundings and learning in the language that they understand, and not everyone has to essentially become a big manufacturer or a service industry person. I mean, you can actually work in your local economy as well to create jobs and to create value where you are, in situ value, right? So I think that some of that hopefully NEP gets implemented well. Some of those ideas get implemented well in the next, let's say, couple of decades. So that is the skills part of it. The second part is how do we manage the more bottom-up question of urbanization and people coming to the cities to look for jobs. I think one issue which has been there is that India has had very few clusters. I mean, just today there was a report, very good article in Enlivenment, which talked about how top 5 states contribute a significant portion of India's GDP, thus creating essentially dependencies on a few cities to basically drive Indian economy forward. And I think that is a puzzle to resolve. Better infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and of course better digital infrastructure will ensure that the jobs can stay where they are or where the people are. People don't have to migrate all the time to do the same value-adding work at the same wage levels to essentially live a particular standard of or quality of life. I think that is a critical piece of puzzle to resolve in the coming years. And I think what I'm quite optimistic about is the whole digital aspect. I mean, look at Karan, he's sitting in a car in some city, and we are still talking and having a podcast fairly smoothly so far, right? The quality of Indian, touch wood, I mean, hopefully we will have Karan through the podcast, but the quality of our digital infrastructure has significantly improved in the last few years, right? This would also lead to several opportunities around services industry itself and high quality business jobs. Like, for example, if you were a very good maths teacher and you were, let's say, in a village, for example, in MP or some other state which is not known for being an industrial state, you could still start a quote unquote business to coach people on teaching maths anywhere in the world, right? If the infra was good. So I think those kind of opportunities which we have not talked about, and like if you like internet changed the way how Indian middle class grew and how the service industry grew in India. I think that is just with the spread of 4G and the advent of 5G, I think we are probably at the tip of that process all over again. So what happened in the last 2 decades could repeat itself and should repeat itself in the next 2 decades again to create those high value jobs.
Yeah, I mean, that's a quantum. Sorry, go ahead, Karan.
No, I just wanted to add some macro perspective to this, because a lot of time the discussion has been that even though India has created jobs, it hasn't been enough, or that they are not high value jobs, etc., that have been created. But from growth process, what we already know or what we have observed is that whenever there's a massive inflow of labor supply, at the entry level wages are more or less stagnant, and that has been the case for these high value jobs. But what is also evident from data is that 5-10 years down the line, there's a lot of filtration that happens, and those who really have the necessary skill sets and keep upgrading them, they tend to move up the ladder So this entire discussion about India not creating adequate jobs, I think it's unfair to say that the economy is not creating adequate jobs. The question that we need to ask is that are we meeting the aspirations of the labor supply? And the broad answer to that is no. For the simple reason that people, what happened in 2014, and this is a direct outcome of the political process, people's aspiration increased significantly. Some of them even rose to an exceptionally unrealistic level. Now, to create those kind of jobs will obviously take a lot of time. But there's again, once in a lifetime opportunity for us to attract the supply chains to India and create those kind of jobs in the rural areas where there are, scope for low skill to high skill jobs coming in manufacturing space. As Ashish has rightly mentioned that, over the next 20 years, there will be a lot of service sector employment opportunities that will come up. They will absorb a bulk of our workforce, especially the educated workforce. For those who go for vocational training or who do not have those necessary skill set, it is these jobs that will come up in the rural areas, which will really, shift the composition of employment within the Indian economy. And that shift again will, as I said, unleash a lot of productive potential, which will drive growth going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that that's a quantum leap waiting to happen, right? I mean, the fact that there's going to be digital access for 300, 400 million people going forward, and at the rates that we have, some of the cheapest data rates that we have, the amount of input that's going to come from that is going to be tremendous at a platform level, that too, right? So, okay, if we don't have any further comments, I think we can move over to culture. Do any of you have any comments to add to this? Okay, seems like we can move to culture. All right, Ashish, I think, we've said this before on multiple podcasts as well. When we look at anything cultural, right, any issues, and we're coming up on almost 40 episodes now. We've discussed a range of these issues. The major schism is between two schools of thought, one that abides by a nation state of 73 years old, and the other which subscribes to a civilization of 5,000 years old, right? You see this flaring up in all of the issues that we discuss. Do you see a process of reconciliation going forward?
See, the thought that India is just a constitutional state, I think, is I would say it's not really based on the realities. I mean, people have memories, living memories, cultural associations, which obviously go back centuries. So I think while a part of the Indian educated elite has been advocating that process, it's clearly that view is not very popular, as has been demonstrated in the political process also, right? And that view is also losing ground sharply. So there is no. The issue is that it was being for over the years it had been caricatured as people looking too much into the past without really being bothered about the future. But I think people have realized that the process of recognizing your past, or at least claiming the important parts of those past, versus dreaming for the future, need not be a mutually exclusive processes. They can coexist. And in fact, I would say that as the country becomes richer and economically more prosperous, in fact, people will probably go back to their roots at a much faster pace. What happens is when people are busy earning their livelihoods, or they have to make compromises in their day-to-day lifestyles because of various reasons, I mean, mainly economic reasons, they don't have time or appetite, or even if they had that, they would not have the atmosphere may not be conducive around you to basically express those opinions around what you would like to correct or change about your past, or claim about your past, reclaim about your past. I think that as a society becomes more like richer, I don't think it will become more deracinated. In fact, it will become more rooted and more grounded in the Indian context, precisely because there's so much around us to essentially appreciate and take time out for. So I think it's the people who are betting on the constitutional state concept, and that leading to basically a global, well-connected people who do not worry about the localized issues of pride or localized issues of historical significance. My sense is they are betting on the wrong side.
Right. So So Ashu, anytime there is some sort of a fundamental cultural development, let's say the construction of the Ram Mandir or whatever, right? So you have a bunch of people who come out and say, hey, you know what, for a nation such as ours, you might as well focus on development, economy, some of those other things, right? Like it's an either or choice, like a guns and butter kind of a choice, or I call it the build a hospital trope, right? So, what is your response to some of this stuff? How important do you think is establishing a good cultural, all of these cultural reforms along with the economy and everything else?
It's a simple thing. First, I would like to clarify that Ram Mandir is getting built with the money which has been donated by the devotees. Government is not contributing a single penny to that mandir development. Having said that, even if the government is suppose giving some money, it does not mean that other things are not happening. So this binary thinking, this illogical stuff, like if you are building a mandir, that means that hospitals are not getting built, is I think liberal stupidity, and it is best if we ignore it. And they have this very bad habit of thinking, either or, creating these whatabouteries, and we should not fall in that trap. We are building cities, we are building smart cities, we are building power plants, we are building bridges across rivers, we are building roads till DBO, we are building new airports, and we are also building Ram Mandir. So all these things are going on, happening as we speak. And I think we should be happy about the fact that the country is moving ahead while also reclaiming its civilizational past. Also, I would like to add one more point, that this nation at 73, or civilization of 5,000 year old, I think going ahead, like Ashish sir mentioned, we will see a lot of people, in fact the Gen Y or Gen Z, going more towards the roots for two reasons. Uh, I might be wrong, I don't have any data, but it is my observation, because I'm a Garibo ka economist. See, my parents and the entire generation, they were always worried about, will I get kerosene, will I get food, do I have to stand at the ration store, phone line 12 months waiting, Bajaj Auto 2 years waiting. Their entire life was a struggle. Number one. Number two, if you see the average frustration that an Indian has, right? We get out of the house, there is traffic, honking, too much pressure. We don't have any surety in life, right? I will reach home in 20 minutes. I don't know. Now, all these things add to your frustration. There is no job security. There is too much of pressure. Now, while all these things are going on, how can you expect the average guy, okay? How can you expect him to be concerned about the civilizational aspects? He will more be worried about, taking care of himself and his family, healthcare issues, etc., etc., right? But look at the pace of development that is happening. Going ahead in the next 10 years, all these basic things, power, water, infrastructure, jobs, etc., those will be easily available. Even if somebody loses a job, he'll have to wait for a couple of months here and there, and then he's, again getting employed, and his routine life starts again. Now, when these things are available at a very easy way, that person will get time, energy, enthusiasm. You need three things to do anything in life. You need consideration. Love is a valid consideration. You need the ability to do it, and you need the willingness to do it. We did not have all these three things going in the past. In the future in the coming future, people will have all these three things, and this question of 73 years or 5,000 years will not be there. We will have many more people who are rooted to our civilization and culture going ahead.
Can I just add one point? And I think Ashu has this wonderful line, explaining things in a simple way. A fairly good point by Ashu there, which is that, see, even if you go back on the political side, when government spent on stuff like power connections or LPG connections, healthcare, Ayushman Bharat, see, people end up trying to find faults at an operational level, saying, well, you said you will electrify 20,000 villages, but you've only done 18,000. So why did you lie about 2,000 villages?
No,
What
my
about-
favorite. Sorry, my favorite is the Jandan, right? I mean, for the longest time they said there's no money in those accounts.
Yeah, exactly. So the challenge here is that the critics miss the forest for the trees, right? Like what is happening? Okay, fine. Let's say only 18,000 villages got power, but the fact that 18,000 villages did get power, and the productivity and the quality of life is going to improve there. So if you let's say put LPG instead of using wood fire for in the kitchens, every person in the household is going to save 1 hour a day, right? And that 1 hour a day can be either economically productive, or to go back to Ashu's point, can be used for other pursuits, which is where other interests can be developed, right? So the thing is, the quality of life improvement is a huge driver. Both is a political driver, it's an economic driver, and it is a cultural driver for things to change. And people don't appreciate that. So people get caught in very simplistic debates about this ism or that ism, socialism, capitalism, libertarianism, etc. But the fact is that unless you have a high quality life, I mean, for example, if your infant mortality rate is improving, which it is improving, or your maternal mortality rate is improving, which it is, those things also lead to economic gains and cultural gains. And I think people don't always appreciate that enough. And I think that to me is a significant change, that those things have become front and center of the political conversation, and people expect that to happen now. I mean, although I mean, of course, no election will be completely fought on those issues, but the fact is that those conversations are now an integral part of the political process. To me, that's a very significant change in the last, let's say, 6 to 7 years.
Yeah, some of these things are so, again, intrinsically linked, right? I mean, Swachh Bharat, for example, I think is a deeply cultural thing as well, as much as it is a developmental thing. So Karan, I'd like to talk to you about what you brought up in your opening remark, which is the Nehruvian state, right? And the dismantling of the Nehruvian state. Now, you are very optimistic on that front. What do you see as cultural implications of this dismantling, and what do you see happening going forward?
So I'll be very honest, Nehruvian socialism finds its roots in dismantling Indian culture. That's the very essence of it. It was, antithesis of everything that India's society, India's culture represented, whether, before the British, before the Mughals, or even, for 3 decades after that. It tried very hard. It tried very hard to, make people, especially a particular community within India, feel ashamed of their cultural existence, to the extent that they made us feel as if, we were some oppressors, despite hundreds of years, centuries of being oppressed. We were made to feel as if we were oppressing India's other communities. So the very fact that we are dismantling that sort of ideology, whether in terms of culture, whether in terms of economic policies, etc., it's a sign that we are okay and we are ready to accept things and embrace things as they are, which means that we are embracing real history about things that actually happened, and we are unapologetic about what has happened. I'll give you a very quick instance. When these statues, when this entire debate was happening, and when people were criticizing Churchill and people were criticizing Rhodes and Thomas Jefferson, etc., India's left were hailing when their statues were being blackened. But it's the same very left that continues to, advocate for a masjid to be at the place of India's most revered deity, saying that, no, it's important for peace, etc. If those statues are an act of oppression, and if those statues are, insensitive, then why shouldn't that mosque, which existed before 1992, also be seen as an act of oppression? Why should it not be seen as, a constant reminder of the atrocities that were faced by a particular community in this country? The limited point being that Nehruvian socialism was based on a combination of factors which included minority appeasement, which included making the majority feel constantly as if they were oppressors, and that sort of mindset was also there within the government, in the sense that the government also treated everyone as if we were not capable of libertarian values when it comes to freedom. We weren't given economic freedom at all for 3 decades, because the government thought that no, people are not equipped enough to make choices. And that continues till date, because there are certain states in India which continue to make choices regarding their people. For instance, Bihar recently banned liquor because it believes that is not in the best interest of the people. So that very mindset which views citizens as incapable of taking decisions, that view needs to change, and that needs to be ingrained in the political process, where we need to really strengthen individual rights, where we need to really be open about things that have happened in the past, where we need to be unapologetic about things that need to be said the way they need to be said. Unless we start being unapologetic about things, and unless we start being honest about where the root and real problems lie in, we are not going to be able to create a truly cohesive society, and that process needs to begin.
Yeah. No, I that's a fantastic point that you mentioned, right? And also, in a way, I mean, the Nehruvian state sort of infantilized all of us Indian citizens in some way, right? By suppressing some of these facts and whatever. With respect to the statues, I mean, I only feel that if you have to hold two opposing points of view at the same time, you either have to be an economist or an Indian leftist, right? Where you can appreciate one thing somewhere and then denigrate the same thing closer home. Ashu, I want to come. Yeah.
In this regards, I want to add, because of Nehruvian socialism, the decadal growth rates were so low, yet these people went ahead and called that growth rate Hindu growth rate. What we will see in the coming future will be the real Hindu growth rate, where the nationalization of banks were done in the 1970s to make banking accessible to everyone. Am I right? But it took a Modi in 2014 to bring bank accounts to millions of people. So the fraud that has happened with the Indian population for 4 to 5 decades is too big. If you see the stage at which most of our Asian economies were there in 1950, and then the way they grew and the way we grew till 1991, you'll get the answer yourself. You don't have to be an economist. You can just see the facts and figures, and you will know.
Let me add a point over here. Before independence, Indians had more economic freedom than we had after independence. This is something that people don't realize. I mean, imagine how absurd it sounds that Indians were more free or had more economic freedom under British rule than under a democracy. That's how absurd it was for the first few decades.
Right. So the other key thing is, like, I would say non-political actors like the judiciary and the media as well, right? Who have been taking an active part in the day-to-day affairs of the state as well. And they impact a lot of cultural things. You see the Supreme Court adjudicate on things like Sabrimala, for example, or Ram Mandir, or other things. How do you see that going forward, Ashu? I mean, I know you've spoken about the judiciary earlier, right? How do you see that going forward?
Oh, well, frankly, I am no expert on cultural matters. I understand very little of it. But I think, see, we are a democracy at the end of the day, right? If somebody has a problem, they are going to go ahead and challenge matters. Say, for example, Sabrimala, or entry into any temple, or for that matter, even Ram Mandir case. People are going to approach the judiciary. It is how judiciary responds to these kind of issues which is important. Take, for example, what is happening in the current scenario, right? Anybody and everybody, just the high, what do I say? Big shot lawyers or big shot celebrities, they go to the judiciary, they file a matter, and they get the hearing in a day or two, while crores of cases are pending. Now, again, I'm not talking in the binary, but the perception of the people with regards to judiciary is on the decline, although the trust of people on the government and the administration is growing. Now, the people are perceiving judiciary as something that they want to avoid, because it is costly, it is time consuming. With regards to what judiciary will do, in respect of culture, I think the other friends on the talk probably can elucidate in a better way. But judicial reforms is something that is very necessary. Rule of law, fear of law. Yesterday, some miscreants, went on the streets, burned down a police station. Why? Because they have zero fear of law, right? Judiciary needs to up their ante. There should be reforms in judiciary, and swift delivery of justice must happen if you have to create a new India.
Yeah. So Ashish, we spoke about media on on the 25th episode, I think, if I remember correctly, right? And how the business of media is changing. How do you see the media impacting the cultural development in India going forward?
Yeah. See, media always used to be a leading indicator in India. The reason being that they were very much part of the establishment. If you see how these stories were created, or the way the reporting was, the slant was typically, right. It was all a large part of this Delhi consensus, Nehruvian consensus, which had been continuing over the years. I mean, the media was very much part of the political process of decision making, and this elite classes ruling the country. I mean, that feeling was very much there. See, what has happened is that media, in my view, has now become more of a reactionary entity in the last few years. And this is not just an Indian phenomenon, this is a global phenomenon, thanks to the advent of internet and social media. The disintermediation which has happened between the consumers and the producers of media, I think that has become very critical. Earlier, the producers never cared about the consumers because the main business or the main funding, etc., those aspects were taken care of by the sponsors. I think that, I mean, of course, now no process can be completely unbound, but at the same time, because of the alternatives which have come in the general operating ecosystem in the media, the dependence on sponsors also, I mean, it's reducing. Plus, there's no ROI in that sense, in the classical sense of hiding stories or doing specific stories with a certain slant, etc. Right? So I think, to me, media will continue to evolve. It will continue to become smaller, more localized, and even if they are national aggregates, the importance of those aggregates will continue to decline, in my view. This is actually, I mean, it's part of a global process of media getting redefined, and in some way, it's good for democracy because people like us who are opining, sitting on a YouTube channel, and we are able to get across our points, even if it's to a few hundred or few thousand people. The fact is that this option is available today, which wasn't available, let's say, a decade ago. That's the issue a traditional media faces, and it's good in some ways.
Yeah. Okay. So if we have no further points on the culture segment, I'd love to move on to politics. Can we do that? Okay. So, in the mix of political, economic, and cultural, arguably, I think political is a key driver here, right? We've discussed this as a vehicle of action. So, Karan, what makes you hopeful that the Indian political establishment and the current state of politics will help us progress?
Well, there are basically three broad trends that need to be understood. First is that since 1980s, BJP's vote share has grown by the same amount by which Congress vote share has come down. So while people look at 2014 and 19 as the real change of power, but the process was silently underway since 1980s. And every successive election, that happened except for 2009, which was a black swan election. What this really shows is that, the moment we started gradually giving people more freedom, more economic freedom, etc., there was a natural inclination to shift away from center-left kind of economic policies. While, I genuinely believe, and I continue to believe, that BJP is also center-left when it comes to their economic policies, and Congress is left, and the left is actually ultra-left. But in the Indian context, it's for anyone who really wants private property, who really wants to, grow, start their own enterprise, etc. It's a very natural fit for them to be aligned with the center left of India, which is the BJP kind of economic narrative. Apart from this, there's this another broad trend in the political space that I'm seeing, and that is with respect to the rise of regional political parties at the expense of the Congress. And that has been underway across several states. What this shows is that we are moving again to a unipolar kind of economic political setup, where BJP de facto becomes the nucleus and regional parties come around it. The problem or the concern that I have is that whenever there's a very strong political party, we haven't seen a lot of consistent reforms over a period of time. We are seeing it right now because we have a political leader who really believes in reforms. But if there's no opposition, then there is no system of checks and balances. So the biggest threat that will be there to India would be the lack of a credible opposition. And the way things are evolving, I think there will be people or citizens who will emerge as pressure groups who will be more credible than some of our political parties. And this process will, in a way, force regional political parties to also up their game and look at issues such as urban governance. Let's take the example of BMC, right? Bombay, which is such a Mumbai, which is such a rich place, contributes quite significantly to our GDP. BMC is the richest metropolitan corporation of the country, but is the urban governance problem over there solved? No. Now, who has been ruling the particular local body for several years? It's the same regional party, but nothing really changes. And at some point, people are going to ask for that change. And the moment that change becomes a part of the political process, we'll see a lot of narratives, or rather political election points changing. Issue of climate change, for instance, will become a political issue going forward. And we'll see a lot of political parties try to present their version of what they're going to be willing to do to address the problem of climate change, sustainable growth, etc. So basically, the next 10 years, we'll see a complete transition as we move from, the narratives of roti, kapda, makan, bijli, sadak, pani to a more probably first world kind of political challenges and political issues where we will be discussing more about issues such as policing, issues such as protection of private property, public utilities, public goods. So those will come at the forefront of the discussion going forward.
Right. So Ashu, as you mentioned, I mean, people are going to get more prosperous due to some of the fundamental reforms and also the dividends that we'll reap, right? So do you also see citizen participative sort of citizen politics, activism growing on that front? I mean, people taking more of an initiative in these things?
Yeah, I mean, that has already been happening, right? For example, if the government is issuing any policy, they do put that particular policy on their websites through TIB, etc., and they solicit comments. Now, it depends on how going ahead, how people are able to read those policies and then take part in the process of governance. Because we need to have, going ahead, I feel that, there are investor groups which, analyze the annual reports and tell the details to investors who are not expected to know the technicalities. Similar way, I think we will have a lot of such groups for policy making, policy drafting, policy understanding, and then getting inputs from these people to be presented to the government and then shape a particular policy going ahead. Like Karan mentioned, it is very much possible that we might also see people electing a particular leader or not electing a particular leader on the basis of how he perceives environment or how he wants to develop a particular region or improve its climate. Now, that has never happened in the Indian society before this, but the young generation, is concerned about these things. It is very, very vocal about it. If you see the kind of protest people do with regards to tree cutting, just very recently near my place, few trees were illegally cut, and youngsters had just come there, to protest about it. Now, if the protest is right or wrong is a separate question, but they are concerned about things other than roti, kapada, and makan is something that the politicians need to look at and maybe shape their manifestos or their ideologies based on the new age problems that are coming in.
Right. So Ashish, we've discussed this earlier as well. We did a whole podcast on the way forward for Indian National Congress. What do you have to say about the lacuna in terms of the opposition and also the rise of regional parties? How do you see this going forward, and what do you think will happen?
I will mention 3 points here with respect to how the politics has evolved. firstly, the idiom of politics is changing. People want to talk about more constructive things and not just criticism. If you go back a decade, the Indian opposition was essentially expected to oppose whatever the point was. A good example is, let's say, the Indo-US nuclear deal. Uh, you know, BJP, if it was championing that deal, would have looked like a natural choice for them to do, because it seemed very much in line with their general policies. But in 2008, they were opposing it big time. Look at the idea of GST. I mean, of course, BJP had some valid reasons not to back GST, but it did oppose GST at that point of time as a concept, right? So I think, and this is despite the fact that the concept was actually mooted by the Vajpayee government themselves. So I think the opposition had become synonymous with opposing rather than actually creating a different mind share. I think that idiom has purpose, and I mean, if you look at the way the regional parties have reacted, I think they understand this far better. Their language is far in line and tune with what the people in their respective states are looking for. More solutions, more constructive opposition. And if you say no to something, you also have to propose an alternative, right? I think that at least the regional parties seem to be very clear about some of those aspects. The challenge for the Congress, which is the second point, is actually on the issue of nationalism, which we have discussed earlier. We have seen a rise of pro-national voices, not just in India, but around the world, where the importance of your own country and how far back it is being pushed by the more, let's say, quote unquote, woke or progressive lobbies. I think people are reacting to that in a big way. I think that undercurrent has not been picked up by Congress. Probably doesn't picked up again better by some of the regional parties. That people want to be unapologetically nationalistic. And again, it's a theoretical point to say what is patriotism and what is nationalism. The fact is that people do not want to talk about or think ill about the country, and certainly not do ill to the country any which way, right? Like burning of flags and stuff like that. So I think that people are resenting worldwide. So I think that is the second theme which will define how the quality of opposition will evolve over a period of time. The third part is that, going back to the earlier discussion, the issue of you can be a global citizen and yet you can recognize your past, right? I think this dichotomy, which in the simplistic ways of the Delhi Consensus, that while everyone is a global citizen, let's start everything in 1947. I think that theme again is not well understood. I mean, obviously, because Congress was very much part of that Delhi Consensus. It evolved the Delhi Consensus to start off. But I think people are completely comfortable in their skins of being a successful professional, working in a high-profile job, being a global high-flying individual, and yet relating to some of the stuff which currently the BJP is talking about, right? I think that those three things, in my view, will shape the discourse of politics. If Congress doesn't factor in some of that, it would have its challenges in the near term.
All right. Do you have any comments, Ashu, Karan, on this?
No, I think I broadly agree with the assessment of Ashish sir, that regional parties have been more proactive in understanding this current shift than the national party. I just feel that one of the reasons why we are seeing the Congress really be virtually politically non-existent is because, well, for starters, they're not interested in the political setup, according to me. I think they're more interested in preserving the dynasty rather than in preserving their political power, or rather preserving the political power of the dynasty rather than of the political entity. And we also see Congress actually take a very hard line towards the left, and not in terms of the liberal agenda, but also in terms of the economic agenda. So as Ashish sir rightly mentioned, that that people could be global, globally sort of working with MNCs, traveling across the world, but those people are generally more vocal about protection of their private property, protection of their private assets, or of lower rates of taxation, etc. And what is happening in India is that we see a very polarizing divide in terms of economic, social, and political parties amongst the two main political forces of the country. And at the same time, we also see a sort of divergence in the views on foreign policy. which largely, which probably I think up until 10 years ago there was near consensus when it came to issues of foreign policy, except for I think nuclear deal. So these broad trends are also important to factor in that essentially we are going away from the process of having hung mandates. Because if the political space is so polarized, then obviously even your electorate is very polarized. And I think that's a good thing, because if we have decisive mandates going forward, then there is to some extent political stability, which can be expected over the sort of 5-year tenure. My only hope is that this political stability is there even for state governments and not just for the central government, because uh, the way India's constitution is written and the way the federal structure is there, a lot of times we blame the central government for issues that should be resolved by the state government. So there's this confusion regarding what is in the center list, what is in the state list, and then there's the concurrent list. I think we really need to get rid of the concurrent list as well, because when you give responsibility to two different governments, none of them are very interested, or probably they can always pass the buck. We see it a lot happening in Delhi, because Delhi does not have the state government does not have full power, and it conveniently shifts the blame to the LG. The LG conveniently shifts the blame to the Delhi government. So these are some bigger challenges to the political system that we need to address. And as Ashutosh sir mentioned regarding judiciary, one of the key things that we've been working on over the last couple of days is to analyze whether PILs are actually vehicles of change or vehicles of misgovernance. And there is a lot of evidence that shows that the reason behind PIL or the objective behind PIL was fundamentally different from the way it is being used or rather misused right now. And to summarize, I would just quote Justice Bhagwati, who mentioned that any intervention by the court has to be done keeping in mind the objective of obtaining a willed result. So whenever judiciary intervenes in these matters, it needs to keep in mind the need to be able to achieve a willed result. Otherwise, it creates more problems than offers any solution.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we did a whole episode on Delhi's governance structure. I think this was episode 3, which did fairly well actually. So to end the podcast, I'd like you guys to look at the looking glass or the crystal bowl or whatever it is, and assume that it's 2030. Assume that you're all doing very well, and you're looking back at the last 10 years, and what do you see as one thing that has happened over the last 10 years, looking back, that has created like amazing prosperity and all the good things that you're experiencing in 2030, hopefully. So maybe we'll start with you, Ashish. Sorry for the long-winded question.
No, I think I would say that the quality of workforce, and the quality of human capital, the way it will change in the next 10 years. I think that, looking back from 2030, that would have been the biggest cause of, let's say, reaching a 10 trillion economy, which I hope we reached in 2030, which would lead to close to about, let's say, $7,000 of per capita income, and bringing us squarely in the mid-income country bracket. And the improvement of the opportunities through digital means, and the inherent improvement in quality of workforce because of healthcare, because of access to education and things like that. I think those, to my mind, will be the biggest change driver.
Okay, Ashu?
If I am in 2030, I hope, and I hope that I will see an India which is connected with each other very well. Going from Kutch to Kohima will be easy. It will be as easy as going from Delhi to Pune or Delhi to Mumbai as of now. I think I will be looking back at a country which will have a very good integrated transportation system. We will have dedicated freight corridors. We will have port-led development. I think I will see an India where housing will not be very troublesome. We will have a lot of affordable housing going ahead. And I will see an India which is thriving in various cities, like not just 4 or 5 metros, but we will have small cities coming up, like say, for example, Indore growing, Pune growing, and these cities will be the churn for the economy going ahead, and the growth will not be restricted to only the metro cities. And I think I will be looking at these things in the next 10 years. Gary.
Awesome. Karan?
I'll actually summarize what Ashish sir and Ashutosh sir have said in a simple line. I think that by the end of 2030, what I really want to see, or when I look back, what I really want to see is that we will start the process of converting rupee into a hard currency. We will be in one of the reserves for the SDR of IMF, and other central bankers would be holding the rupee as a stable store of value, because that's the amount of international trade that we will be participating in, and we will be a very big player when it comes to financial services industry globally, comparable to even twice what Singapore is doing at present.
Fantastic. So that's a really optimistic note to end the podcast on. Thanks so much, Karan, Ashu, and Ashish for being on the podcast. Thanks again for your time. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This was a really fun conversation. Again, from all of us here, wish you a very, very happy Independence Day, and Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.
Then.
Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Vartha. If you like this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. Speaking of, we're available on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Vartha to facilitate long-form discussions on policy, politics, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. But if you do wish to offer us feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvartha.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.